2024 Independent Civilian Advisory Commission meeting to order. Beginning roll call now. Rebecca Carabez, Marco Durazo, Mike Fisher.
Here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Mike Fisher, Alexis Lewis, William Mickler, Shirley Melnico, Kalima Salehudin,
Here.
Robert Solano,
Here.
James Simmons.
Here.
Thank you. We will now move on to item number 2, general public comment. This item is reserved for persons wishing to address the Independent Civilian Advisory Commission on a topic within the jurisdiction of the Commission, but that is not on the agenda. Public comments on matters on the agenda shall be heard at the time the matter is called. Please fill out a speaker slip. The Commission may not discuss or take action on items not on the agenda. And please note, we did receive 3 written public comments prior to the meeting. They were shared with the commissioners and posted to the Independent Civilian Advisory website at smcgov.org/ICAC. It's now for general public comment. Please bring a speaker slip up to the clerk during this time. For those of you joining this meeting online, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Each person will be granted 2 minutes to speak. We will move on to public comment in the regional operations room and then proceed to comments on Zoom. We have 2. This is general. We have 3 public comments or speaker slips. When I call your name, you may come up to the podium. You will have 2 minutes to speak. I'd like to call Nancy Goodman up to the podium. The podium is actually at the very end of the table. Thank you. Yes, Nancy Goodman. And please unmute the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Goodman. I live in Redwood City. I'm with Fix in San Mateo County, and thank you for listening. I was hoping that...
One moment, please. I'm going to put on the timer. Thank you.
Great. I was have a few things to mention, but I was hoping we would be talking about a community complaint process that was on the onboarding list, and I just urge the commission to add that maybe to the next agenda. But my comment was, first, taxpayers have paid out $13.4 million in the last couple of years due to sheriff issues and sheriff misconduct. So I'm just urging that ICAC can hopefully look at what these payouts are for and try to prevent future incidents. Second, we do need an independent review of deaths in the jail, as other people have brought up. There have been multiple deaths, 2 suicides, 2 drug deaths. The jail shouldn't be serving as a mental health hospital, and it shouldn't be serving as a drug detox unit. What we should have is the county building other kinds of diversion resources, and that's been recommended by the Behavioral Health Commission. And just a reminder, they're still not getting mail. They're still not getting postcards and birthday cards from their kids and stuff, so that'll be a great thing to add back in. Maybe we can find out, hopefully ICAC can bring in Santa Clara County, San Francisco County, the other counties that do allow people to get mail. And finally, thanks for talking about voter registration. That's still urgent. We've got 2 months to the, 2 months and some until the election. Only 9 people voted from the jail in March. We have I think they estimated last year 80 registered in our jail compared to 600 in the San Francisco jail, which is a similar size. So we have a long way to go. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. I'd like to call Bill Newell, followed by David Vallegra. Bill, come up to the podium and you have 2 minutes to speak.
Who would I give these to? Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Bill Newell. I'm a 30-year resident of San Mateo County, Redwood City. I'm a member of San Francisco Peninsula People Power. We're a member of the Coalition for Safer San Mateo County. My public comment, again, is similar to what Ms. Goodman just mentioned, and that is recently there was an $8 million payout by the county to a former member of the sheriff's office who filed a case over sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that was settled by the county, but it cost the county $8 million. My point is that there needs to be more oversight about the culture that is going on within the sheriff's office, specifically the conduct that this particular woman suffered in terms of harassment that other members of the sheriff's office were reported to observe but take no action. She had filed numerous, this is all in court documents as reported in the newspaper. She had reported numerous reports to the Human Relations Department. No action was taken. And finally, when she finally filed a lawsuit, the county finally started to look into it. My point is, true oversight would have prevented this, and an $8 million payout is probably one of the biggest payouts that's ever been made in this county for any kind of misconduct by the county. And so that's my concern that I'd like to share with you tonight. And I implore you to do your own research. Look in the San Mateo Daily Journal for the report. Came out in this past month in August. Thank you.
Thank you. David Vallegra, please come up to the podium.
It's kind of cool. I get to sit here with you this time. My name is David Vallegra. I'd like to talk to you about your name. This is the Independent Civilian Advisory Commission. When the Board of Supervisors created this commission, they didn't have to use the word independent. It would have been perfectly fine if they just called it the Civilian Advisory Commission, but they used the word independent. And I think that word independent has a meaning, and I think it has a significance for you. There are two threats to your independence. One is the possibility that you could become or be perceived as simply a PR extension of the Sheriff's Department itself. Frankly, I don't think that's going to happen. But the other threat, frankly, is the staff. The county staff has spent the last 2 meetings telling you a great deal about what you can't do. And I haven't heard them say much about what you can do. And if you are going to be dependent on staff for what you can and can't do, and this includes the county attorney, then you're not independent. And if you're not going to be independent, I suggest you go back to the Board of Supervisors and ask that they strike this from your name, because you're not going to be able to do the job that the taxpayers need you to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call for public comment in the Regional Operations Center. Okay, moving on to public comment on Zoom. We have 2 hands raised. When I call your name, I will unmute your mic and you will be granted 2 minutes to speak. Let's begin with Pat Willard. When you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you. I'm Pat Willard, founding member of the Men's Anti-Racism Coalition. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend the last meeting. Actually, I did not know that it was taking place. As the gentleman just said, we know that we've spent a lot of time on what you can't do and what you can do. I exchanged an email with Mr. Mike Callaghy, the county executive, asking him about what the committee's or commission's responsibilities are, suggesting that it would have the power of investigation. Mr. Callaghy replied to me that the commission has no authority to do any investigation. So I take it that the advisory commission is to advise the Board of Supervisors about when the Sheriff's Department has done things that are not, shall we say, kosher or overstepped bounds or didn't protect people in the jail. My question, therefore, and I hope that you will get to it sometime in this meeting, is to ask, how is the commission supposed to advise the Board of Supervisors about something they want to be looked into when the commission has no authority to investigate anything? Thank you.
Thank you. We will proceed with Caroline Vertogen, and the last speaker will be Beth Von Emster. Caroline, please unmute please begin when you're ready. Caroline, you may begin when you're ready.
You keep on asking me to unmute, and I've done it twice already.
You are unmuted now. You may begin when you're ready.
Great. Thank you very much, residents who are doing this big service to San Mateo County. I represent many students, many healthcare professionals, many parents who have not had a voice. We have submitted the allegations of abuse, fraudulent, illegal, and criminal conduct to our law enforcement, and they have decided not to investigate this. So this is very important. And it's not just San Mateo County. It is also Santa Clara County, the FBI, and everybody else. Apparently they are silenced, and perhaps you should look into how they are funded, because they are only funded of good behavior. So I agree with everybody, and especially David. Thank you so much for bringing this up. You're supposed to be independent, yet the county is telling you how the process works, what you can do and what you cannot do. This is not a democratic, independent process. And I hope that you will realize this. And I will continue to listen, but it's very important because there has not been any justice for several years in San Mateo County and actually in the whole California area. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two speakers, Pat and Beth Von Emster. Pat, you may begin when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. I would like to vehemently agree with David and others who are talking about the basic problem of this commission, which is that independent is in your name, and yet it seems like you're being hampered from doing your job because you're given so many restrictions. I'm very familiar with this problem because I'm experiencing it. I had an experience with the sheriffs back in March. I was a witness. Someone gave false information to sheriffs. I was interrogated in front of a number of witnesses in the building I live in. Those witnesses were irate that a witness who was trying to help was essentially, battered, violently, verbally abused, wasn't allowed to give the truth of what she said because someone else informed them before they spoke to me and gave them false information about what I had seen, heard, and said. And I've been trying to find out since March who the officers are without contacting the sheriff's department because I'm terrified of retribution. And I have reached out directly to the sheriff because I was impressed enough with her remark to your commission that I thought she would be willing to listen. But apparently the officers involved have fed her a partial or false story about what transpired that day, and I haven't been able to get a meeting. And they keep throwing out that it's a joint special investigation and therefore the officers are anonymous, but they didn't follow the procedures she talked about in her presentation to you. Somebody needs to hold the department accountable if officers are not following her rules. Nobody at my building, including the property manager or myself, received any ID card from any officer that day. And since then, officers have shown up here, and when I ask about that rule, I'm told, oh, yes, if you ask for it. Someone who's interrogated by officers without warning, who's basically sandbagged on a walkway in a public space, in earshot of the person they're investigating, and they're asked questions about that individual, sorry, they're not in their right mind to ask for a card. That should be the officer's responsibility to provide it.
Thank you, Pat. Your time is up. Okay, we have one last hand raised, and it's Beth Von Emster. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. I just want to say that I hope the prior speaker, Pat, will continue attending these meetings and seeking justice for the wrongs that she's experienced. My name is Beth Von Emster, and I'm a member of the Coalition for a Safer San Mateo County. I want to thank the commissioners deeply for your service, and I echo others in asking that the ICAC look into the 5 deaths that have occurred in the jail since 2023. That's 5 too many, and it's an absolute tragedy. These people have children and families, and no one should die alone in jail, away from their families and loved ones. Independent reviews of jail deaths in other counties have uncovered straightforward policy and procedural changes that could protect lives going forward. And you would have several blueprints for doing a similar investigation if that's a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call for public comment on Zoom. Okay, we have no more hands raised.
Members of the commission, I just wanted to alert folks that item number 3 on the agenda is a presentation from the sheriff's office on their data dashboard. This was pushed from the last meeting. Unfortunately, the presenter had an unexpected family issue arise and is unavailable to present. So we'll push this to the next meeting so that she can attend and share that information and make adjustments, which leaves us with a slightly shorter agenda, no less. Okay. No less important, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. McClure. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think probably we should get in the habit of beginning after taking public comment, approving the agenda. So, with the chair's permission, I'd suggest that you entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
No problem. So, can I get a motion to approve the agenda with item number 3 removed for a future date?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye? Or do we need to do roll call?
You don't.
So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Thank you. Moving on to item number 4.
And that's me. And I have a presentation. And that's it. So, is there a clicker, or am I just going to say next? Okay, that's service. So, hello, everybody. I am still David Silverman, and my title is Assistant County Attorney. I've worked for the County Attorney's Office now for 21 years, and for most of that time, I have been assigned to the Sheriff's Office. In fact, I've served 4 sheriffs. Don Horsley was the first, and then now Sheriff Corpus. So, this is going to be very similar to the presentation that I did to the Board of Supervisors in the fall of 2023. So if you saw that already, I apologize. You'll be seeing a lot of it again. There are some additions. I was asked to add a section dealing with talking a little bit more about what this commission is, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because that was covered by the last. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's new. I've also been asked to talk about the internal affairs process, the investigation of officers for misconduct, and I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about that as well. I may modify what I say a little bit from what I presented in the fall. So even if you saw that, it'll be a little bit different, and that is because I don't have a script. And so I will probably make some mistakes, and I will probably say things a little bit differently this time, but that's okay. I haven't actually updated the information from the slides. Except where it was clearly needed. So there's also a little bit of a chance that some of the information's outdated. I don't think so. It was only 5 months ago, but it is a possibility. So the purpose of this presentation is very similar to the purpose when I presented to the Board of Supervisors back in the fall, which is that in the fall, what the board was trying to determine was what was necessary with respect to oversight of the sheriff's office. And I was asked in that context to present on the oversight mechanisms that already exist, because the board understood that to the extent that they were going to do something, it had to fit within that framework in order to be efficient, to make sense, to not be repetitive, or, so things didn't trip over themselves. And I mean, in some ways, it's equally useful, I think, to you to see how you fit in with these other things, but also just so that you know what else exists out there, so that you are aware of the sources of information that already exist that can help you as you are advising. I could spend probably a day on the subject. I was originally offered 20 minutes. I asked for 30 to 45. I think that's going to be a push. There's one slide that I have that I could spend a half an hour on, and that's the slide that deals with decertification of police officers, and I'm going to spend 2 minutes on it. I also note, I'm a human being, and I have biases, some express and some implicit. I am trying to present this in a way that is protected by my biases by just presenting factual information about the laws and the structures for oversight that exist. But I had to pick and choose. Like, I chose what I was going to include and what I didn't. I don't have a script. I'm saying what's coming into my head as it's coming into my head. So, I'm hoping that that despite the fact that this presentation is curated and the fact that I do have biases, that I am providing you hopefully just accurate information. Finally, and this is the end of my disclaimer, people say things all of the time in meetings like this, and I'm not talking about you, and I'm not talking about anything that happened today. People say things that are just not accurate, or not factually accurate. And I sit up here and I often want to respond to those things, and I want to say that's not true, that's not accurate. And I don't And I don't do that because I advise you not to do that, and I figure I should take the same advice that I give. But I do want to observe that, since I am going to spend a lot of time talking today, and some of that stuff relates to things that have been said, that I'm intentionally not responding to the things that I hear that are inaccurate. And if ever you want to talk to me about what I hear that's inaccurate, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But I don't think that now is the time or the place for me to do that. So, with all of that, next slide, please. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about Assembly Bill 1185, that's what AB stands for, Assembly Bill, and existing models of oversight, and that's some of the new stuff. Then I'm going to talk about the various persons, organizations, and public agencies that already provide oversight for the Sheriff's Office, and that's mostly going to be a repeat of what I did in the fall. And then finally, I'm going to talk about new legislation related to oversight, and that's also mostly a repeat of what I did in the fall. And then as I'm in number 2, I'm going to talk a decent amount about the internal affairs process. Next slide. So what is Assembly Bill 1185? It was a law that was adopted in 2021. It became effective in January 2021, and it is codified in the government code. Next slide. So what it did was it codified already existing authority that the board had to create an oversight board and or an Office of Inspector General to provide, to help the board in providing oversight of the Sheriff's Office. You are not either of those things. You are not an oversight board, and you are not an Office of Inspector General. The board did direct staff to develop a stable of inspector generals that could be retained on an ad hoc basis to investigate things. And that process is well underway. It's not done. I suspect it will be done relatively soon. Of course, I'm a lawyer, so what does soon mean? Relatively soon. It's not done yet. But staff has been working diligently on that. I don't actually believe that an Assembly Bill 1185 oversight board exists anywhere in the state of California at this point. And let me caveat that. There is a board down in San Diego. It's existed for years that serves an oversight function in San Diego. It long precedes AB 1185. San Francisco has an oversight board, but again, it was not created under 1185. It was created, I believe, pursuant to a charter amendment. And its role, according to its website, and a lot of the information that I'm going to present today about these oversight functions just comes from me looking at the internet. So, I'm looking at the websites, I'm reading the source materials, but ultimately, the information is only as good as what is on the internet. It says that the San Francisco board, that its role is to oversee the Inspector General. That is its role. And oversight boards pose a lot of significant legal issues that have yet to be resolved by any court. In part, again, because as far as I know, there's never been an 1185 oversight board that was created. Alameda County, I think, is very close. They've been talking about doing it for a very long time now. And last I checked this summer, it seemed like they were close to doing it, but they still haven't done it yet, at least as of last time I checked, and that was about 3 weeks ago. Next slide. So there's been a lot of discussion about Santa Clara County and what they have. So, I'm not gonna read my slide. The information about Santa Clara is up there. Santa Clara has, I would say, the closest, not identical, the closest system to what we have here in San Mateo County. The biggest difference, in my mind, is that they have a permanent inspector general, whereas the county is going to have an ad hoc inspector general, and I'm not suggesting that's not a big deal, but it's a difference. It also has an advisory commission. And part of the reason I'm highlighting this is that when you look at what you want to do, and you know, I recognize that there's a push for you to do lots of things right away, and I'm not telling you you can't do that, but what I am reiterating is that the purpose of what we're doing right now is to try and provide an orientation of information that we think is going to be useful to you to figure out what you want to do, with the goal in December of telling us what you want to do. Now, again, for you, that might not be fast enough. For members of the public, that may not be fast enough. And, you know, we can certainly talk about that, but that's the plan, and that's what's been happening so far. But I think that looking at what the Santa Clara Advisory Commission does, you know, could be something that is of interest to you. And we can certainly present more on that if you like. Next slide. Another example, this one's closer to here, is the Redwood City Advisory Commission. As you can see, again, I'm not going to read my slides. I'm not a slide reader. But I again mention that because it's a local commission, it's advisory like you are, and it's doing stuff. And it may be a source of information about things that you might want to do. Next slide. I'm also going to talk a tiny bit about Sonoma. You know, there's been a lot of discussion around the time of forming you about Sonoma. You know, originally when the Inspector General was created in Sonoma, it was created without subpoena power. It was later, subpoena power was later added. There was, you know, a big fight over whether or not the county did things right, and ultimately the courts decided that they didn't, because they did a bunch of things without meeting and conferring with the unions, which is what delayed the ultimate enactment of the subpoena power until 2022. You know, a couple of things, and again, I recognize that, like, I'm trying to just provide factual information, but I understand why it could appear like I'm trying to steer you in a direction when that is not my intent. But if you look at Sonoma, which I would argue is one of the more robust systems that has been set up, and you talk about investigating complaints, my understanding, and again, this is from the website, the Sonoma County Inspector General does not accept and investigate complaints against the sheriff's office. It accepts them, and then it turns them over to the sheriff's office to investigate. And, you know, we could have a long discussion about why that is, but it's a function of the way that the law works, I believe. The advisory council in Sonoma is, again, very much like you. It's advisory. It does not have subpoena power. And this is going to sound like a criticism. It's not a criticism. But, you know, as far as I can tell, it has not passed any items publicly in over a year. That's not to say it doesn't meet. It meets. It meets. It talks. But it has not done anything, as far as I can tell, from its website in over a year. Okay, so that's just sort of some framework stuff to talk about what you are. You are an advisory commission. You advise the board. You can ask for information from the sheriff. You can make recommendations to the board to do things and to exercise its oversight function of the sheriff's office. And it's all laid out. You know, I recognize that, you know, there's been, you know, a lot of talk about what you can't do and not what you can do. And, you know, respectfully, what you can do is is laid out by the board in the resolution that adopted you. And we presented that last meeting. Next slide. So these are most of the people/entities that perform oversight functions of the sheriff's office. None of these things are theoretical. None of the oversight that is performed by these entities is theoretical. It's all real. I could give you an example of how each one has actually provided oversight recently. With the exception of the United States Department of Justice, it has not done any oversight activities recently, but the rest have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what most of them do. Next slide. So, I feel like I need to explain, why do I have the sheriff as an oversight over the sheriff's office? Well, that's because the sheriff does oversee the sheriff's office. That is her job. And, to the extent we're talking about oversight, usually we're talking about oversight of the sheriff's office. And that is what she does. And in that context, I have been asked to talk a little bit about the complaint process, that the sheriff's office has with respect to its officers. I've been told that is an area of interest. So I will note that to the extent you have more interest in this, it's probably better to hear from the sheriff and not from me. But I have been intimately involved in this process for over 20 years, and so I can certainly share what I would describe as a slightly better than anecdotal understanding of it. So I'm going to refer to it as the internal affairs process because that's what I call it. So I have seen complaints come in to the internal affairs process in a lot of different ways. Sometimes complaints are made directly to the Board of Supervisors. And when the Board of Supervisors get those complaints and they're about officers, they're generally forwarded to the Sheriff's Office to investigate for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they come into me. I get complaints, and then I also forward them to the Sheriff's Office to investigate. I also make sure that they are actually being investigated when it happens. Sometimes they're made directly to the sheriff. Sometimes they're made by civilians, residents of the community. Sometimes they're made by systems, so judges have made complaints. Members of the public defender panel have made complaints. Sheriff's Office employees have made complaints against other Sheriff's Office employees. And in fact, state law actually requires that if Sheriff's employees see certain types of misconduct that they report it. So for example, if they see what they believe to be excessive force, they are required by law to report it. And if they don't, they're subject to discipline, and I've seen that happen too. But actually, the majority of complaints, and this is anecdotal, are actually not initiated by a complaint form at all, but by the sheriff or the sheriff's executive team, based on information that comes to them in a variety of ways. And I'm actually going to provide a specific example before I'm done. So, next slide. This is part of the policy on internal affairs complaints. It starts on page 637 of the 1,195-page policy manual, which is available online for anyone to look at. I am just going to excerpt the first page of the policy. I'm going to highlight, before I go on, the last paragraph on the second sector, because I'm going to talk a tiny little bit more about that in the process of going through this. It is understood and it is policy that that folks who report misconduct cannot be retaliated against be retaliated against, and retaliating against them in itself would be a policy violation, subjecting an officer to significant discipline. This policy, and in probably too long, I'm going to get to a little more of it, has to be followed. There's actually legal authority that makes clear that the policy has to be followed, subject to enforcement by a court. So if the policy isn't followed, someone can file a lawsuit and force it to be followed. And that has actually happened, not in San Mateo County, but that has actually happened. And what it means, what this policy means, that almost every complaint has to be investigated. Now, sometimes an investigation may be more limited. So, for example, if the sheriff's office gets a complaint that a deputy was rude, but the entire interaction is on body-worn camera, and basically everything is on body-worn camera nowadays, they're going to go look at the body-worn camera. And if the allegations in the complaint are clearly untrue because the camera shows that it didn't happen the way the complainant said it would, well, that may be the end of the investigation. But the vast majority of complaints, they're all investigated. They have to be investigated. So all of the complaints that come in are routed to what's called the Bureau of Professional Standards. There's an office on the 5th floor of the sheriff's new building, and the Bureau of Professional Standards is there, right next to the Sheriff Corpus's own office. So it's the sheriff's there, and then this is not a huge space. The sheriff's up there. The Bureau of Professional Standards is up there. The sheriff actually served in the Bureau of Professional Standards when she was a sergeant, and I worked with her significantly when she was. It's currently made up of a sergeant named Fava, Joe Fava. He reports to a lieutenant named Irfan Zaidi, and they are under the command of Captain Phillip. I believe they're currently recruiting for another sheriff a sergeant to replace Zaidi, because he was recently promoted to lieutenant, and he has stayed in the Bureau of Professional Standards. So when the complaints come in, the Bureau of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs, works with the sheriff's executive team to decide who is going to investigate the complaint and ultimately what is going to be charged. And what I mean by charged is that the sheriff's office goes through this 1,000-page manual. They don't really have to go through it because they know what's in there. And they determine whether any of the allegations, if true, would be a violation of policy. And the policy manual basically folds in any kind of misconduct that you could possibly imagine. Anything that could conceivably be deemed by anyone to be misconduct is in there, including what is affectionately known as KUBO, conduct unbecoming an officer. Basically, anything that anyone does that is unbecoming to the profession, whether it's in public or private, is subject to, when I say private, I mean, I don't mean in their home, but like in public, whether they're working or they're not working, is subject to discipline. It's important that they go through this charging process, because there's a law that I'm not going to go into today, referred to as the Peace Officer Bill of Rights Act. People call it POBAR. It's actually POBRA. It's sort of a touchy thing with me. But it requires that before an officer is interrogated about misconduct, that they be notified of the charges against them, so that they have a due process right to know what they are going to be interviewed about. So in the more complicated, higher profile cases, the internal affairs folks, mostly Joe Fava, he works really, really hard. they investigate the more complicated, the higher profile ones. If it's a simpler case, someone in the officer's chain of command will investigate it. Very rarely, the sheriff's office will hire an outside investigator to do it. And they will interview all of the relevant witnesses, and usually the officers interviewed last. They'll gather all of the necessary evidence, especially video. And as I noted, nowadays almost everything that the officers do is captured on video. And they are actually required to turn on their body-worn camera before they do anything of significance. And if they don't do that, they will be disciplined. So once the investigator believes the investigation is complete, the investigator will turn in a report. Sometimes they're less than a dozen pages. Sometimes they're 100 pages. The reports are reviewed by numerous people in the command staff, and when appropriate, they get sent back for more investigation. Ultimately, if allegations of misconduct are sustained in the report, the undersheriff decides on the appropriate level of discipline, which could be a letter of reprimand, it could be a suspension, it could be a demotion, or it could be termination. And all of those things have happened. Demotions are the most rare, but all of those things have happened. As far as me and my office and the Human Resources Division, we can be involved prior to a determination that discipline is appropriate, but most of the time that's when we get involved, when a determination is made that discipline is appropriate. Every disciplinary letter that's drafted is drafted by Human Resources based on the content of the Internal Affairs report and the decision of the undersheriff. The report and draft letter then go to my office, where we then evaluate whether the discipline is supported by the investigation and is consistent, that the investigation is consistent with the level of discipline imposed. Usually it is. Sometimes we conclude that the investigation would support more discipline. We look to the experience we have and how other people have been disciplined for the same things. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally we'll say, hey, there's someone else has done the same thing and has gotten more discipline, or that someone's done the same thing and gotten less discipline, and we spot those issues. You will also sometimes determine that the discipline proposed is too severe. And what we mean by that is that if the discipline is challenged, my office is going to have to defend that before a hearing officer or an arbitrator, and we want to make sure that we can win. And sometimes there's disagreement, and we talk about it. Ultimately, what happens next is an intent letter is issued to the officer that tells the officer what was found as far as misconduct and the discipline to be proposed. The officer is then entitled to what's called a Skelly hearing. There was a court case in, I think, the 70s, and the title of the case was Skelly. Was it the 70s? Yeah. And it basically entitles the officer to this informal hearing where they can explain why the investigation got it wrong, or why the discipline isn't appropriate. They can be represented by an attorney. It's not a trial. They don't get to present witnesses, but they do get to provide their side of the story. And then following that, the undersheriff, who's usually the person who does that hearing, will let the Human Resources Department know whether the discipline is changing or whether it's going to stay the same. It usually stays the same. And the Human Resources Department drafts a decision letter that basically implements the discipline. And at that point, if the decision is to fire them, they're fired. They're gone. They're off the books. If the decision is to suspend them, they're suspended. They do get another right to appeal. And with respect to the deputy sheriffs, they actually have a choice. They can appeal to a independent arbitrator, or they can appeal to our Civil Service Commission that's appointed by the Board of Supervisors. And they get a full-blown evidentiary hearing. I have handled a number of those. This is my one point of pride. I've won every single one of them. That's not to say that they're all winnable, and that my office has won every one, but I have, and I'm proud of that. Next slide. So I have heard a number of comments that people are afraid to report complaints to the sheriff's office. And I am not saying that is not true. I hope that we can work together to try and allay that fear. I have never heard in 20 plus years of a single instance of anyone ever complaining about being retaliated against for filing a complaint. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm just saying that itself would be subject to a required investigation and discipline. And I have never seen that in 20 years. You know, I will note that incarcerated persons file complaints with reasonable frequency. I want to just take a little more time just to share just like a case study, and then I'm going to be done with this and I'm going to move on. And I'm sure I'm already blowing way through my time, so I appreciate you bearing with me. So let's say, for example, that an incarcerated person is found with a broken wrist and says it occurred during an altercation with a deputy. Now, that should already be on the sheriff's office radar, because all uses of force are required to be reported. And if it wasn't reported, that in and of itself is going to subject the officer to discipline. So let's assume that it was reported as a use of force. Every documented use of force is reviewed, and the Internal Affairs Department has access to all of those reviews. If the review of the use of force determines that the use of force was not consistent with policy, and that doesn't mean it has to be constitutionally excessive, it just means that it has to be inconsistent with the policy, an internal affairs investigation will be opened. I'll note at this point that this use of force, where this hypothetical incarcerated person, their wrist was broken, that use of force, in addition, of course, to being reported to the sheriff's office, has now already been reported to the Attorney General of the state of California. Because every single use of force that results in serious bodily injury has to be reported to the California Attorney General. It would also need to be reported to the Office of Peace Officer Standards and Training, POST, within 10 days of it happening. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my slides. So it will then be investigated exactly as I described, and if the investigation determines that it was excessive, the officer will be disciplined, and the incarcerated person will be notified that the complaint was sustained. It will also be reported again to POST that the complaint was, it'll be reported before it was sustained, it'll be reported again after it was sustained, and then the incarcerated person can also, if they wanted to, report it to POST as well, independently. POST will review that, and if it determines that it is appropriate, it can decertify the officer. Presumably, and this has happened, the incarcerated person will also get a lawyer and will file a lawsuit, which we will then also need to report to POST as part of the decertification process. So that is probably more than you wanted to know. about the process for investigating misconduct of officers. Hopefully, it met the ask. If not, as I said, the sheriff's office is probably a better source of this information than I am. Next slide. So, not much to be said here. The sheriff answers to the people who elect her, just like every other elected official. Sheriffs are not always reelected, nor is the heir apparent always elected. San Mateo County, as I think you all know, has a meaningful number of competitive elections involving the sheriff's office, including 2 of the last 4 sheriffs. Next slide. So, California Attorney General, we talked about it a little bit. The California Attorney General actually has direct supervisorial responsibility over the sheriff's office. I am not going to suggest that the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, is calling up the sheriff's office all the time or is constantly doing things. That would not be true. But it does have the authority, and it does utilize it. So, for example, last month, my office, I think it came to my office. Yeah, my office received a letter from the Attorney General's office raising concerns that were raised with it about access to feminine hygiene products in the jail. My office worked with the sheriff's office to get the information that was responsive to that complaint, and we provided it. And I believe, and it's not about winning or losing, but I think we refuted, the complaint that was made. But the Attorney General took it seriously, asked for our response, and we provided it. As I mentioned, all serious uses of force are reported to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General does investigate. It has never investigated the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, but does investigate serious uses of force, does prosecute officers, does conduct investigations. Next slide. So the district attorney, independently elected. I understand, why people don't believe that investigations done by the district attorney are independent, and I'm not going to try and convince you that they are, even though I believe that they are. The advantage that the district attorney's office has over basically almost anyone else who conducts investigations is that they actually can access peace officer personnel records. Peace officer personnel records are confidential, with some exceptions, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But they're confidential. Release of them is a violation of the law, is a crime. And people can't just look at peace officer personnel records. The DA can. And the DA does when he's conducting investigations. The district attorney also investigates every single death that occurs in custody. And when I say in custody, I don't mean just deaths that occur in the correctional setting. Any death that involves a law enforcement officer is considered a death in custody and is investigated by the DA's office. Again, with an exception that I'll talk a little bit. There's a new law that I'm going to talk a little bit about where the Attorney General is actually required to investigate versus the DA. But otherwise, the DA investigates every death in custody. And when they're done, they release the findings, and they release them publicly, and they release their reports, and people can go and they can look and see what the DA did and what the DA didn't do, and they can look and they can evaluate whether they believe that the DA did a good job or not. Next slide. Coroner, also independently elected, required to investigate all causes of death for deaths involving law enforcement, and the coroner does do that. Next slide. The controller, also independently elected. And I keep saying independently elected because they don't answer to each other, they answer to the voters. That's not to say they can't be friendly with each other, and maybe they are, but they're independently elected, and they all independently They all independently answer to the voters, and they all take their jobs very seriously. I mean, I'll just say the controller takes, just like the other elected officials, takes his job very seriously, and is very carefully watching the way that everyone spends money and that is consistent with county policy. Next slide. So, Board of Supervisors, I mean, we kind of talked about that already. The Board of Supervisors does have oversight over all elected officials, including the Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney, although there's a special carve-out with respect to the District Attorney and the Sheriff because they're constitutional officers with constitutional duties. And the Government Code 25303 specifically provides that the board cannot obstruct the investigative function of the sheriff or the prosecutorial function of the district attorney. And when you look at AB 1185, which we talked about, it has that same carve-out in there. And AB 1185 is designed to provide a mechanism for the board to receive assistance in performing its existing function. And it's something that it could have already done, just like Sonoma did it before 1185, Santa Clara did it before 1185, San Diego, Sacramento, San Francisco. It's something that the board always had the power to do. It has subpoena power. It adopted an ordinance in, can't remember the date, a while ago, that allows it to create an independent citizens review panel. I think it's 2.04 of the ordinance code. Sorry, I heard a little bit of an echo. That body can also be established with subpoena power and conduct investigations of elected officials, not just the sheriff. Next slide. Talked a little bit about this. There's no recent example of the U.S. Department of Justice investigating something. I worked on an investigation that the U.S. Department of Justice did in 2010. That link right there is to the report of the completion of that investigation. It does absolutely do investigations. That other link is to a consent decree that it relatively recently got with respect to the City of Los Angeles Police Department. But again, as I noted, it's not super active, with respect to San Mateo County. But in addition to just its regular oversight ability and duties, it also is responsible for implementing the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was a law that was enacted in 2003. It has adopted a 128-page regulatory rulemaking on compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. It's referred to as PREA. And I just mention it because it's something that our jail has to comply with, and it has a lot of requirements. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and to the extent that there's any interest in that area, there's a lot of information that exists. Next slide. And we're on slide 19. We're way more than halfway done. I have 11 slides to go, but I'm picking up the pace. The Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, it selects, anyway, I'm not going to read the slide, and it's responsible for the decertification process. I'm going to talk more about that later. Next page, next slide. There's the Board of State and Community Corrections. It also has adopted 70 pages of regulations that need to be followed in the correctional setting, and that is responsible for ensuring that there's compliance on. It does inspections to ensure compliance. And I'll talk a little bit more of a new role that it has that took effect this summer. Next slide. So, this is not necessarily intuitive. and it kind of dovetails, what I was talking about with respect to complaints. So the sheriff's office conducts criminal investigations. Those criminal investigations result in prosecutions. Those prosecutions go to court. The investigations are tested by the lawyers for the defendants. And sometimes, they prove that an officer violated the Fourth Amendment. That's going to get to the sheriff's office and is going to be subject to an investigation and subject the officer to discipline. We get sued all the time. There's been discussion, about those lawsuits, and some of that information is inaccurate, but those lawsuits test whether or not the sheriff's office is doing something wrong, and when they reveal that something is wrong, that those things are addressed. Again, I could spend a lot of time talking about the variety of ways that the sheriff's office is held accountable by the attorneys and the judges in the system. It is. Next slide. So there's the grand jury. The primary function of the grand jury is is to look into, and it's not just the sheriff's office, it's the entire county, it's all the school districts, it's all of the public entities in the county. It's a watchdog, and its primary function is to root out functions of government that aren't working well, and try and improve them. And the grand jury has looked at the sheriff's office a number of times. That's 4 examples. It makes recommendations that need to be responded to publicly. So in that sense, it is providing oversight. It does have the authority to remove officers who have committed elected officials who have committed serious misconduct, and it did vote to remove the Santa Clara County Sheriff relatively recently, although I believe that she resigned prior to being effectively removed. The grand jury is made up of 19 citizens selected by the court, and they're citizens just like you. They're well-prepared, very civically minded people who want the government to function well. Next slide. Media. There have been a lot of newspaper articles about the sheriff's office recently. You may have noticed that. I think we had a comment about that today. The media is another entity that holds government accountable. They make lots of Public Records Act requests. I was talking to a reporter this evening about a Public Records Act request. They are active, and they are serious about what they do. This is actually old. I said this back in the fall, and I could come up with other examples, but I'm a little brain tired at the moment. When I presented to the to the board back in the fall, I noted that this was in October that we'd had 3 significant Public Records Act requests just in the last month. One was from Forbes asking about investigative technology that's used by the sheriff's office. Another one was from PBS asking about use of force records, specifically the internal affairs records that are public, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then one from the San Francisco Standard that was asking about our RIPA data, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The sheriff's office spends a significant amount of time responding to Public Records Act requests every week. I don't have the number, but I suspect that it's many hours every week responding to Public Records Act requests. Okay, next slide. So this is a list of some, but not all, of the significant new oversight related legislation that's been enacted relatively recently. All of it took effect relatively recently. I'm not going to talk about each one of them, and I'm close to wrapping it up. Next slide. So this is the monster slide. I mean, I could spend so much time on the decertification process. Senate Bill 2 requires that the sheriff only hire certified officers. It also, and this is not decertification, it actually made it easier to sue law enforcement officers for civil rights violations. It disqualifies officers found to have committed significant misconduct from being certified. It created a new office called the Peace Officer Standards Accountability Office, and this is underneath post. I have been told by someone who works in that office that they'll eventually be staffed with 32 investigators. They have to review investigations of the sheriff's office that involve the serious misconduct that is reported, and they have to perform additional investigations as they deem needed. That does not mean they need to reinvestigate everything. If they believe that the investigation is thorough and complete, they do not have to reinvestigate something. The law created a 9-member board to oversee the work of that new office, appointed by the governor and legislators. The majority of that 9-member board is made up of public members, including those with a background in police accountability and members who have experienced wrongful use of force. It requires the board to report on its activities, including the number of reports, investigations, and decertifications. It requires sheriffs and police departments to report allegations of serious misconduct, regardless of whether they're sustained. It requires sheriffs to forward all investigations finding serious misconduct. It requires sheriffs to complete all investigations involving serious misconduct. And serious misconduct includes dishonesty, including a whole bunch of different types of dishonesty, including tampering with body-worn camera video. Abuse of power, including but not limited to intimidating witnesses or knowingly obtaining false confessions or making false arrests. Physical abuse, including but not limited to excessive or reasonable force, so it does not have to be excessive or unreasonable. Sexual assault, demonstrating bias on the basis of any legally protected status, acts that violate the law and are egregious or repeated, that are inconsistent with a peace officer's obligations to uphold the law, participation in a law enforcement gang, failure to cooperate with an investigation into potential police misconduct, and failure to intercede when present and observing another officer using force that is clearly beyond what's necessary. It requires the sheriff to provide a reason why any officer is separated from the sheriff's office. As of last May, I understand that this new office had received 3,500 reports. I will note that most of those were historical, going back to before 2020. There are 200 to 300. I tried to count them, but I got tired. There are 200 to 300 decertification actions that are listed on the website. 2 of them involving former officers from San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, and you can Google it. You can look at it. The officers' names are there. Next slide. RIPA, Racial Identity Profiling Act, I believe, is the acronym. Oh, there it is, Racial and Identity Profiling. It's on my slide. RIPA is another sea change. I think it's a little bit too soon to know exactly, how significant it's going to be. And I just saw an article recently talking about concerns about RIPA data that was in the newspaper, not ours, but like I think LA's and maybe San Francisco's. what RIPA requires is that each agency ensure that whenever anybody is stopped or has a significant contact with law enforcement, that 16 different things are captured, including the location of the stop, the perceived race or identity of the person stopped, the perceived gender, whether the person is perceived to be a member of the LGBTQI community, the perceived age of the person, whether the person stopped has limited or no English fluency, perceived or known disability. They need to record the reason for the stop, whether the stop was made in response for a call for service or whether it was independently initiated, the actions that were taken by the officer during the stop and the results of the stop, as well as a unique identifier for the officer and the officer's years of experience. And so all of that data needs to be collected and all of it needs to be reported. And as the slide notes, there was a the law provided for collection to begin on a staggered basis with the larger departments collecting first. So the sheriff began collecting the data in 2022 and began reporting it in 2023. And all of that data is publicly available. Next slide. So a number of transparency laws were adopted over the last few years. Senate Bill 16 is, in my mind, the most significant, although arguably, I mean, it's really just an extension of an earlier bill, Senate Bill 1421 that was enacted, I want to say 2019. And basically, as I mentioned before, previously all misconduct investigations of law enforcement officers were completely confidential. No one could access them. What Senate Bill 1421 and then Senate Bill 16 did was change that. And what it means is that now, if we're talking about serious misconduct, and when I say serious misconduct, I'm talking about perjury, failure to intervene, unlawful arrest, unlawful search, bias, discrimination, excessive use of force, all of that stuff, when those investigations are complete, if they are sustained, those reports are public record and are released pursuant to a Public Records Act request. And all of the Sheriff's Office reports that are consistent with this law have been turned over to the ACLU, to PBS, to a group of reporters that work together to gather up this information, and I believe they have a publicly available database. I've never seen it. I believe that it exists. I know what's in there because I gave it to them. Except with the exception of force. So any investigation, whether it's sustained or not, that involves serious bodily injury or death of a person, all of that stuff is public, regardless of whether misconduct occurred or was found. AB 481, I mentioned because when you look at what some advisory commissions have done, like you, they have looked at the reports on use of military equipment that law enforcement agencies use, and they provided recommendations on them. I put military equipment in quotation marks, and this is definitely editorial. So this is an editorial warning right now. What this law describes as military equipment is not what I think the vast majority of people believe is military equipment. What I mean by that is when people think I think that when people think military equipment, they think about stuff that came from the military, that they bought from the military. But that's not the way AB 481 works. It's actually way broader than that. So basically, any drone, it's a $20 drone. It's subject to this policy. It basically means that anything that is listed as military equipment under AB 481, it all needs to be documented. All of the use of it needs to be documented, and an annual report needs to be made to the Board of Supervisors about how it's being used. The board needs to approve an ordinance that reflects how it's being used, needs to approve what can be purchased, and they also have to have a public meeting to discuss all of those things. 2 more slides. Next slide. This is another sea change. It doesn't address the 5 deaths that happened in the jail that have been talked about in these meetings. As I mentioned, and I recognize that people believe that the DA and the sheriff and the coroner, that their investigations aren't independent, and that more should be done. And ultimately, that's certainly an opinion that people are entitled to have. But going forward, beginning in July 2024, all deaths in the jail are going to be reviewed by the BSCC, and they created a separate special board to oversee these investigations. That they're required, at the conclusion of those investigations, they're required to make recommendations to the sheriff that the sheriff is going to have to respond to. So again, it doesn't apply to the 5 deaths that have been referred to already, but it will apply to all future deaths in custody. Next slide. There's been a lot of action in the area of use of force, and that was probably a really terrible unintentional pun. Sorry. The one that is most significant, at least in the abstract, is AB 26. Basically, AB 26 set out what needs to go in every policy with respect to use of force, and this is really significant because policy is everything. Policy is everything in law enforcement, is in the sheriff's office. We talked about internal affairs. We talked about complaints and investigation. What they are doing is they are looking at the policy and they are saying, was the policy complied with? Did you do what the policy said? And if you didn't, you are subject to discipline. And AB 26 laid out in extraordinary detail what needs to be in every use of force policy. Now, I said in the abstract because ultimately the sheriff's office policy already largely complied with AB 26 when AB 26 was adopted. There were some tweaks that needed to be made, and they were made. But it is, for someone who works with law enforcement, I think it is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that has been enacted as far as affecting the way that law enforcement is going to interact, with the community. It's a very important piece of legislation. I'm not going to talk about that. Last slide. I mentioned this earlier. AB 1506 is new. As I mentioned, previous to AB 1506, whenever a death in custody occurred, it was investigated by the DA. And in the jail, it was investigated by the coroner as well. AB 15 and the bill I talked about. So the sort of the big change is now the deaths are also going to be investigated by or investigated and or reviewed by the BSCC, and then with respect to deaths outside of a correctional setting, any officer-involved shooting that involves the death of an unarmed person. So if the person is armed, this doesn't apply. But if it's an unarmed person, previously those were investigated by the district attorney's office. Now they're going to be investigated by the attorney general's office. We have not had one of those, thank goodness, in the county since this law has been adopted. This is going to be the last thing I'm going to do. I'm just going to read a little bit from the Attorney General's website because I think this is important. When an officer-involved shooting occurs, transparent and open communications is critical to maintain public trust. As part of that, in alignment with AB 1506, the California Department of Justice will, as soon as feasible and appropriate, disseminate relevant information and materials about covered incidents and ultimately make public its determinations regarding the criminal prosecution of such incidents. Where criminal charges are not appropriate, the California Department of Justice will prepare and make a written report communicating that. Will provide a statement of facts as revealed by the investigation, an analysis of those facts in light of applicable law, and an explanation of why it was determined that criminal charges were not appropriate. Now, RDA has followed a similar process for years, but under AB 1506, the Attorney General will be stepping in on those. So, I really did not track time. I have a feeling I probably went over by about a half an hour, and I apologize for that. But I appreciate your attention, and to the extent you have any questions, I can answer those. Although, perhaps we should take public comment first.
Does anyone have any questions?
Okay.
Yeah. It's a button right there.
The one about, I thought a riot or something, you said you would skip over that, you didn't want to discuss that one on that, wait, 2 slides back maybe?
Yeah. Could let's see. The dispersal of the protest one.
Yes.
Yeah, it's mostly just, I knew I was way over my time, but basically AB 48 limits the use of certain weapons to disperse a protest. This is extremely anecdotal. This is extremely anecdotal. I don't believe there has been any recent incident where the sheriff's office has used any weapons to disperse a protest. And I mentioned it, there's actually a lawsuit that my office is defending right now that stems from the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. There were a bunch of protests in Oakland and everywhere in the country, obviously. And the sheriff's office was asked to provide mutual aid to help with crowd control in Oakland. And the sheriff's office actually, it wasn't just the sheriff's office, it was a grouping of, it was a grouping of officers from the county. And ultimately, there were dispersal weapons that were used at that protest, and someone was hurt. And he actually sued the city of Oakland first, and then he actually sued us, the city of Atherton, and 2 other cities. And basically the issue was he didn't know who had fired the dispersal weapon that had hit him. And ultimately through that lawsuit, we determined that it wasn't us. And in the process of learning more about that lawsuit, I was told that we have not used a dispersal weapon to disperse a protest at the sheriff's office in recent memory. But again, that's very anecdotal. I could be wrong. Yeah.
Go ahead, Marco.
There was, on the slide that was online, a customer service link
Yes.
that deputies share or give out to the community. I
Right.
feel like I missed it on the slide, but I saw it on the PowerPoint that was posted.
Right.
Can we look at that real quick? I feel like I was waiting for it. I saw it
Yeah,
online,
and
but I didn't
again,
see it
like,
on there.
I apologize for taking too long, and I apologize for cutting stuff out. I just, I wanted to be respectful, but yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I think it's on slide, it's the slide with the sheriff, I'm pretty sure. It would have been pretty early on. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, so there's no link, but this was something that Sheriff Corpus decided to do. This is new, basically, and I was hoping. I'm not super familiar with but my understanding is that all of the deputies have cards that have like something you can scan as well as a link that they're supposed to give out to everyone when they have a QR code that they're supposed to give out to everyone when they have contact with them. And the folks can fill out the survey and provide it to, fill out the survey, and it all goes, I believe, to the executive team for review. So that's another way for the sheriff to find, it's not, the purpose of it is not to like discipline officers, and in fact, if someone alleges misconduct in one of those surveys, they're going to be asked to make a complaint, and even if they don't, you know, it can still be processed. But it's very hard to investigate complaints when the complainant doesn't cooperate. Not impossible, and it's done because we have video for almost everything now. But it's much more helpful when folks actually fill out the complaints and cooperate with the.
The language is different than the one that was posted, right?
Really?
That's not what was posted online. It said a customer service process, and the language was different than what I'm looking at right now.
Huh.
It
I don't want to
literally
say
had the
anything
words
is impossible,
customer service
but
on there. It literally had the words customer service on there because I just looked
yeah,
at it.
customer service at the bottom
and
there.
the link, and it had a larger description. But anyway,
Oh, I'm sorry.
that's okay. I have a request for you. Where is that data? Is it publicly available? And if so, can we look at it? Can we be
The
shared with
customer
us?
service surveys. So I honestly don't know a lot about them. I do know that they're not publicly posted anywhere, but I mean, that's certainly.
Because the reason I'm bringing it up is that I know the folks who called in, and these are folks who are calling in, they're describing an experience very different than what you just described is supposed to happen.
Right.
And as we move into November and we start thinking about what is our role, I'm just feeling at the moment like I don't have any data.
Yeah.
I need more data. I also want to know more data about the complaints that are logged that you described.
Yeah.
How many were investigated? What is the end of that of those results? Because I think before we get into November, I need to know that.
Yep.
And I want to have that in front of me. And I would love to know this customer service process here. Just in aggregate, it doesn't have to identify the officer, but I just want to know what those aggregate numbers are, and if those things were followed up, and what the summary of those interactions are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very thorough report, David. I was interested about the district attorney having public reports on all the deaths in the jail, and I would like it if we could be able to access those, if you could give us where we can find them. That would be
Okay.
useful.
I have a question about is it Inspector General that is being set up, and are those independent, and then what's really their role or function?
So they will be independent. Their role and function is when the Board of Supervisors determines that something needs to be investigated by an Inspector General, the board will activate one and will provide it guidance on what it wants investigated. Yes.
Yeah, when they talk about the subpoena power of the Inspector General.
Yes.
Is that under the authority of the Inspector General if they are appointed by the Board of Supervisors, or where does that subpoena power authority come from?
The board has subpoena power. The board has subpoena power, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, and then the other question I had is the in-custody death inspector?
Yeah.
Where is that function housed?
The new, under the new law?
Yeah.
Under the BSCC, the state agency, the Bureau of
And so those are the
Community
28
Corrections, State
people?
Community Corrections, yeah,
But that they're gonna do that for all deaths?
yes.
Yep, and then you asked about the Inspector General, and David had referenced it. The county did, following the board's direction, submit an RFP to develop a bench of on-call Inspector Generals who have various expertise in different areas. And we've received a number of responses, and actually just this week sent out the selections. We still need to enter into contract with those folks, but think we'll have 4 or 5 separate inspector generals that are on call for us for the future.
So I don't really have a question, I have comments. So this meeting it's a lot of being talked at by everybody. Everybody. And I'm trying to take everything in that everyone is saying. But I don't know what our role is. It hasn't been clearly defined, and I am uncomfortable taking action until I understand what I'm supposed to be doing. But I will say that truth is relative, right? So, you can ask my daughters when they get into a fight, my twins. When I ask them what happened, each of them is telling the truth. And so I hear you when you're talking about your truth, but we also need to leave space for other truth. And I hear you when you acknowledge your bias. I'm also trying to do the same thing. And the reason I'm here is because, I'm a mother to 3 black children, and I watched the video of Chinedu Okobi being murdered I don't know how many times. And so a lot of the policies that you're talking about have been in place, and I saw nothing happen. So that informs my bias. And I know that informs a lot of people's bias, that, I want to have faith in my law enforcement. If something happens, the first thing I do is call 911. And I want to, and I know a lot of the people here want to build, and how do we build that pathway of trust? And I think one of the things that we have to do is allow multiple truths. And have that space to do that. I don't know what's going to come out of this body. What I'm hoping will come out of it is that we can learn enough and take the time. I do want to take this time to hear from the sheriff. I have no problem with the sheriff coming in and hearing from you. And then taking that information and deciding who else I want to hear from. But I just want to put out there that all of these slides were true when things have happened, that some of those slides should have caught. And they didn't. So how do we fix it? That's why I'm here. And I want everyone's help with that. So I was asked before to move to public comment, and that's why I didn't, because I just wanted to say that first. And unless anybody else has anything to say, I'm fine moving on to public comment.
Okay, members of the public, if you wish to comment on agenda item number 4, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom or bring a speaker slip up to the clerk during this time. You will be granted 2 minutes to speak at the time your name is called. We will begin with in-person public comments. We have 3 speaker slips. Let's begin with Nancy Goodman. You may come up to the podium and speak when you are ready. And the next speaker will be Bill Newell.
Hi, thank you again. Nancy Goodman from Redwood City. Thank you for the thoughtful presentation, David. One of the reasons for all these oversight laws and that you discussed is because there's been police misconduct. Every single one of those laws was passed into law and signed by the governor because of some problem that happened. Specifically, ABA 1185 was launched because the Sacramento sheriff misbehaved. He didn't like a report his inspector general did on a shooting, and so he didn't let the inspector general go into the jail anymore. So they passed a law, AB 1185, and signed it. The other piece that I wanted to point out is that the Coalition for Safer San Mateo County is part of a larger statewide group, the California Coalition for Sheriff Oversight. We've got 12 active counties. We meet monthly. The head of the Civilian Oversight Commission in Los Angeles attends, and is actually speaking with us at the end of this month on a public Zoom. The head of the Sacramento Civilian Advisory Committee attends, and a member of the San Francisco Sheriff Oversight Board attends. So I would encourage you, I mean, I'll invite you to our Zoom, but it'd be great to hear from some of the other oversight boards and agencies. We've also got coalitions from Riverside and San Bernardino and San Diego, and then a lot of our Bay Area counties, Sonoma, the ones that were talked about, Santa Clara, Marin, Monterey, Alameda, and stuff. So the other piece is, I think, in terms of, the second point was in terms of complaints. It is a concern to me that we in Fix in San Mateo County have a public website and a public email, and people complain to us. So, you know, that doesn't make any sense. We have problems with that. Finally, we do need an Inspector General function permanently to look more broadly, not just at an incident, but how to prevent, what are the patterns and practices, how to prevent it in the future. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you. Bill Newell, followed by Trina Patton.
So thank you for the presentation tonight. It was a lot to chew on. It's a lot for all of you to learn more about. It's a foundation of oversight is how this topic was on the agenda. I want to point out again, this kind of builds on what my comments were earlier, and that is simply that effective local oversight can look at incidents that you learn about through whatever sources they may be, and media was cited tonight as one of those sources, and make recommendations to prevent similar incidents in the future. I think that's what good oversight is. You're trying to make things better. It's not about who's doing something wrong. It's what have we learned and how can we make things better going forward so these things don't happen again. So, for example, when I talked about tonight about an $8 million payout for things that were going on within how systems and policies and procedures were operating within the sheriff's office, why was there no accountability that could have prevented the harassment cases that were brought but never acted on? Okay? That's just an example. It doesn't make sense at all to wait for the media to pick up on a story before addressing it. The media is not an effective source or means for oversight. It happens to be kind of our last resort of how we learn about things when we can't learn about them through any other means. And there's a lot of tools that were put out tonight, but I think that there's things to be looked at in terms of what our experience has been in San Mateo County, particularly with these cases that were related to the lawsuit, the $8 million payout for the deputy, and another $3-4 million payout for Chinenu Okobi in terms of what happened to him because of tasers. So then the question becomes, do tasers really have a purpose within the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office? Are all sheriff's offices
That's
using
time,
taser?
Bill.
Maybe not. Something to be given more thought of. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina Patton.
Good evening, Trina Patton from Belmont. I'm not going to thank you for the presentation. I found it incredibly annoying and self-serving. I think that this commission, first of all, was not set up because the board had some grand idea to get people involved. It was set up because citizens up and down this county for the last 2 years went in front of the board and insisted that something like this be created. It's not effective without an inspector general and subpoena power, and I hope one day that we will get there. It's not a big leap to see why people who have a problem with the sheriff don't want to contact the sheriff. It's not a big leap. It's not a big leap to understand why somebody who's been retaliated against by the sheriff doesn't contact the sheriff. It's not a big leap at all. Additionally, you know, I've heard over and over again, oh, the sheriff is an elected position and elections are a form of oversight. What am I supposed to base my opinion on? Where's the data? How do I get to determine independently if I think the sheriff is doing a good job? I'm a voter, I'm a taxpayer. Those are my dollars being spent. So how do I get to determine that if the only data I get is what the sheriff wants me to see? One of the speakers a couple of weeks ago said something that I think is a good standard, and that is, he said, the data that people want you to see is public relations. The data that they don't want you to see is transparency. And I think there needs to be a lot more transparency. I hope in December that you guys will tell the board that you need to be more than an advisory board. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call for in-person public comment. Okay, we'll be moving on to Zoom public comments. We have 4 raised hands. We'll begin with Beth Von Emster, ending with Caroline Vertogen. Beth Von Emster, you may begin when you're ready.
Mr. Silverman, you talked about what a thorough complaint and investigation process the sheriff's office is required to follow, presumably as a suggestion that it's not necessary for this commission to set up its own complaint process. While you've been speaking, though, I've been on the sheriff's website trying to figure out how to file a complaint. I found a form buried deep in an online references tab. The complaint form is a PDF available only in English, and the only way to submit it is to print it out and mail it with a stamp. No way to submit it by phone or online and receive proof of receipt. That doesn't give the public a lot of confidence that the office is taking complaints seriously. I'm curious if there's anything illegal or otherwise impossible for this commission to set up its own process for receiving complaints about the sheriff's office. Because some complaint mechanism outside the very office that is being complained about is necessary to restoring public confidence. I'm in spaces where I've heard about a multitude of complaints from people who are deeply fearful of and flatly refuse to contact the sheriff's office. And Pat, who gave public comment earlier, actually tried to make a complaint by contacting the sheriff and got radio silence in response. I'm also separately just curious, you mentioned decertification as a remedy for misconduct, and I'm wondering if it's possible to say whether the deputies who were involved in harassing and assaulting the SWAT team officer and who just got paid $8 million, who was just paid by the county $8 million for those incidents, whether those deputies have been decertified. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker will be Pat, followed by Pat Willard. Pat, you may begin when you're ready.
I want to thank David Silverman, and I realize you have an overwhelming task to try to present this information coherently and comprehensively in a ridiculously short amount of time. And I know there's a lot of data on these slides, but I want to return to the sheriff's slide. And I want to say vehemently what that slide says in the 3rd bullet. The sheriff has implemented a customer service survey for every person who has contact with her deputies in the field. And what she said to you guys in her presentation remarks in one of the early meetings, I can tell you from my own experience, no officer gave any information either to the property manager or to me. To this day, 6 months later, 5 months later, we don't know who they were. We don't know their names. We don't know their titles. We don't know their phone numbers. And every attempt we've made to get the information, we reach a brick wall. Joint investigation, special investigation, basically hiding behind anonymity. It makes it impossible to file a complaint when I don't know who they were. And I 100% am afraid of retaliation. I live in a building that is Section 8 for people with mental health disorders. Mine is PTSD because I have a stalker who's a veteran. Her department, before her and being in charge, did everything possible to ensure that though my stalker turned up at this building multiple times because he figured out where I was I was not allowed to get the photographs to file a restraining order. And I've had a lot of experience with interactions with officers whose behavior is abusive and completely inappropriate, not willing to serve, not willing to take complaints, and not acting with the interest of protecting and serving the public. So I encourage this commission to do what you can to get independence and take complaints independently. I think there's a mountain of people like me hiding in the shadows right now who don't speak English, who are disenfranchised, who are terrified of saying anything.
Thank you, Pat. Next speaker is Pat Willard, followed by Caroline Vertogen.
So what I heard was a presentation that I would have titled, Trust Me. We are asked to trust the sheriff. We're asked to trust all of the internal investigations of the sheriff investigating the sheriff, of the district attorney investigating the sheriff, which, as everyone knows, the district attorney is not a independent person of the sheriff's department. One hand washes the other, in other words. I did want to also name check Los Angeles County Supervisors or Los Angeles County Sheriff's Oversight Commission. For my observation, this is a exemplar of sheriff's oversight. You can probably watch some of their recorded meetings on YouTube if you want to see that organization in action. Unfortunately, Redwood City's advisor to the chief of police was mentioned because I am probably the only person who has ever attended those meetings from the public. Just me and only me, because they're really more of a performative operation. Each of the members of that advisory committee spend their time giving their personal opinions to the sheriff. I'll also say that in a year and a half of continuing attendance in those meetings, only once has the committee voted for something. Only once. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline Vertogen. You may begin when you're ready.
Great. Thank you, commissioners. I hope you will listen to the residents and taxpayers who have lived in San Mateo County for several years, over 30 years. And what you've seen is, again, it's a prepared statement from a paid employee who's defending his position. We have tried all these policies. There is a disconnect between what is advertised and what happens in reality. And then we find out that the people who are supposed to do the investigations are not really trained. So please demand that you have a portal where we can submit to you our submissions, what we have encountered for over 10 years. It's more than that. It's ridiculous. And so this is your duty. It's an independent investigation, so don't let you be controlled by these people who are paid. You will pay a service to all the people in San Mateo County and beyond, because the law is advertised, the law is not enforced, and they all work together because it's paid on. You get paid, you get promoted by promoting the political agenda. That's what it is. It's sad. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call for Zoom public comment. Okay, there are no more public comments.
I just wanted to make one quick comment in response to Commissioner Durazo's request for data. We hope to have some more data at the next meeting, and we were hoping to have it here today. There is, in the interim, a website, a Sheriff's Transparency Portal, that has a good bit of data that at least you could take a look at to see what's there, what's lacking in your opinion, and otherwise. So we'll send out the location for that information to the commissioners soon. Thank you.
Does it include the data I'm looking for?
Some of it.
Some of it, because I'm looking for two categories, right? So I'm looking at the complaint process, how many were filed, how many were investigated, ultimately what was the end result. So I'm looking for that. And secondly, I'm looking for the customer service summary or results. So I'll take a look at the portal, but those two in particular are the ones that I'm most interested in, would like to see.
Yeah, I think it does have the complaints and the outcomes. I'm not sure if I know it has a customer survey click. I'm not sure if it shows the results of the customer survey things, but that's something that certainly this body could make a recommendation to include, and we'll try to get that information for you.
Alrighty.
Present as a recommendation to make those in different languages and also make that available online. But this is the transparency portal, what you'll see. And then if you go back to the sheriff's homepage, that second tab up top, the next one.
And is this information inclusive of in custody as well as in the community?
It does talk about who's in custody, as well as it breaks it down in that transparency portal. If you go there to the transparency portal, and there's that customer satisfaction survey. Yes.
So the dashboard that they were going to talk about is that something different than this? That was this.
I think it's mostly this. They're going to go over the data that exists there and describe it. They may have additional information that she was planning on presenting, but this was likely the most of it.
Will there be some historical data? Because I went on this earlier, but I couldn't see previous years.
We can ask, since we have a little bit of time before the next meeting, we can ask to make sure that we include some of that information, if historical information, if it's available. Also, they'll be prepared to answer the question about the customer service data.
I think if you go to the complaints and use of force, it talks about who's in custody. Keep going down. Oh, I'm sorry. I would say one or the other. Crimes and arrests. But I'm sure that they'll go through more in detail.
Okay. Is there any other comments on this item number 4? All right, moving on to the next item, which are any announcements that we or the liaisons may have.
I'd like to ask to be added in the sheets that we're going to review.
They can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. On some of the topics,
Yes,
some of the topics that we have, and I'd like to add, since September is Suicide Month, that some type of a presentation by the Sheriff's Office involving their employee assistance program involving suicides for law enforcement officers. I'd like that as a topic area to be added to our group, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? All right.
Sorry, we did so Kalima and I have worked with the agendas coming forward, and we're going to have regular meetings. ahead of time so that we have the input in our setting agenda with the input from the commission and the public and obviously staff. And in going through, we kind of set up, went through the proposed onboarding curriculum. And in doing that, we concluded that we probably would not have a meeting on October 2nd. And so I think we're proposing, with the commission's consent, that we cancel the meeting of October 2nd. So we'd have a meeting on September 18th, then October 16th, November 6th, with the retreat on November 16th.
Yeah, unless, I know the question was, since October 16th was heavy, did you want to, or do we want to keep all the items on the 16th?
I think that's the right thing to do. What you guys described is not have the meeting on October 2nd. And
Okay.
We'll make sure everything's as streamlined as possible for those other meetings.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes, go ahead.
I'd just like to know how we are going to create the agenda items. Could we see the agenda, the commissioners see the agenda before you submit it? Or how do we add things to the agenda?
Let us know. Yeah, send it to us. That's one of our functions, is to create the agenda, but the agenda is also, I mean, this is kind of our agenda.
I know.
So, if there's items on here that we don't want to discuss or we want removed, does everyone want to do everything that's on this agenda or have all of this reviewed?
Well, I was just concerned because if we're gonna remove October 2nd, that means we're not gonna hear from the district attorney or probation, right?
Right. They were taken off.
Yeah, and we were discussing
Yeah.
possibly hearing from them in January. I'll let you express. We were sort of had good guidance from Kalima.
So my thinking was the district attorney is a whole other animal. Like, how many things are we gonna get into before we start getting to the point where we're gonna make some recommendations or take some deeper dives? So do you also want to get a deep dive into the district attorney's office and have all of that? Or do we just start first with, we have a lot of things that are coming to us from the sheriff's office, and that we keep our focus on the sheriff's for now, and then look into picking top 3 or 4 that we would like to start making recommendations on? Because I thought it was kind of muddying the waters. Like, okay, now we're going to hear from the district attorney. Now we're going to hear from someone else.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my thinking. But
And I agreed with that, and I think staff agreed as well. So we thought we'd just push those into January and get a presentation later, that there's enough, we need enough information about the sheriff's office to help us think about, okay, what do we want to focus on at the retreat on November 16th?
Okay.
is that okay? All right.
Yes, that's
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
But if there are items, and we have heard from the public some items about, review of deaths in jail and things like that, I think if there are specific topics that we want to get more information about, so that to help us with the retreat on November 16th, then please communicate that to us so we can figure out how to potentially incorporate that into the agenda.
Right. And how I was looking at it was, I'm trying to get information on what I would like to possibly then make a recommendation to all of you, that these are the things that we focus on to hopefully present to the Board of Supervisors, as these are the things that we recommend, or these are the things we would like to see changed, these are some policies that we like implemented, et cetera. So I'm trying to get information on the specific to those items so that I can decide, or I'm trying to get as much information I can so I can decide where I think is the greatest need and where we should focus first. And if there's so much that I'm trying to see if there's a way we can eliminate some things that we're like, well, this is not something that we think we're going to probably focus on in the beginning. So that is what Bill and I did. We went through and took some things out that we thought, well, that's probably not something that we would necessarily focus on right now.
I also would think it would be good for us to all have had a jail tour before the retreat, and I'm having issues on how do we set it up.
I know we all completed the
Yeah.
the form. Yeah, I thought someone was going to reach out to us.
Okay. We'll follow up with the sheriff's office to make sure that you guys are getting the available dates. I know they were trying to put, certain number, 3 commissioners at a time on certain dates, but we'll make sure that the sheriff's office follows up with you guys promptly, because I think that will impact what you might want to focus on when you're doing your work plan for the year.
Good call. Thank you. Anything else? Any other comments?
I think just last comment.
Yes.
I just really agree with the way the chair and vice chair are prioritizing kind of the workload. And I think November is going to be consequential. We're going to be meeting on a Saturday. You get me away from my family and my kids on a Saturday, it better be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as long as we can work toward articulating and the parameters of the independence of this group, I think working in that direction is something that I'm excited about. So I appreciate the chairs for their efforts and their strategic approach to it.
Thank you. Okay. With that, unless there's any other comments, I know I'm turning it over to our liaisons. If you wanted to say anything. Okay. No problem. Making sure. All right. With that, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.